Welcome everybody to Taking the Tradition On, and it is a really exciting and special evening tonight. So I'm going to try and rattle through all the things that I need to say every time. So the first is, this is a webinar. I know we have got a few people who haven't come before, so if you're expecting to see lots and lots of different boxes, you're only going to see 4 tonight because there's me and I've got 3 fabulous and lovely guests. Everybody else, we don't see you and nobody else sees you, so you can put your hair in curlers, you can, do your nails, slop around in a dressing gown, be as comfortable as you like, and just tell us the beautiful cocktail dresses that you're wearing on the chat and we will believe you. Also, we can't hear you, so rustle your sweet wrappers, munch on your crisps. We won't know, and you're not going to disturb anybody apart from the person who's sharing the sofa with you, so maybe ask them, but otherwise you're fine. But you can communicate with us. So if you are not already on the chat, if you look, it's usually just sort of at the bottom here, but it might be on the side on your device. There's a little row of icons. If you can't see them, you might need to wiggle your mouse or just wiggle your finger around. And you will see chat. So if you click on that, then you can write onto that. Make sure that you put to all panelists and attendees if you want everybody to see it, though you can just send messages to me or my guests as well. So Carl's on a chair with a malt whiskey. There you go. He's already got himself well comfortable. Yeah, Janice on the couch. She's still on the tea, but then it is a lot earlier in America. I'm just going to pin my video because we keep seeing little highlights of Joseph, little snippets of what's coming up. So yes, we've got Canada in tonight, we've got Belgium in tonight, we've got where else do we say, we've got all sorts of places: Canada, America, Antwerp, Belgium, but Christine about to have lunch in California. So because Jack does go all the way around the world, and that's what we're celebrating tonight, and we have a 2-hour special. Hooray! So there will be a break tonight, unusually, but otherwise, yeah, sit back, relax. 2 more little things, thank yous, that I need to say before we get properly started. You'll see this lovely sign behind me. We are here courtesy of Get a Word in Edgeways Festival. This is their Zoom account, which means I have the push webinar function. So thank you very, very much to them. Yes, we would have had the festival last weekend, was the idea. You'll have to wait an extra 51 weeks now, but never mind, it will be worth the wait. And I also need to say thank you very much to the Arts Council England, who fantastically gave me some money to be able to spend some time this year revisiting my apprenticeship with Duncan Williamson. So Duncan Williamson was a fantastic, wonderful storyteller. He was a Scottish traveller, and he left me 4 big boxes of reel-to-reel tapes. And this year has been about getting those digitised. Thank you to everybody who put into the crowdfunding account as well to get me started on that. And then to have some time, I'm 45 now, and I was in my teens when I met Duncan. So to revisit that apprenticeship and that time that I spent with him from a much different perspective, and to re-look at those stories, and a lot of those stories are Jack stories. So I'm going to introduce you to my fabulous guests tonight, and I'm going to and they're all storytellers, so I've had them all on mute so that I could get through the introduction, otherwise the introduction takes about half an hour. I'm now going to let them speak and say hello. So you will see gathered around me, we have the fantastic Heather Yule from Scotland, who grew up with stories and songs. Her mother, Barbara McDermott, I've actually been listening to because she recorded some of the recordings that were on my tapes when she was interviewing Duncan. I'm not sure if Heather was sort of one of the girls playing in the background. She may probably well have been. And so Heather and I, we're having quite an interesting time because I'm working with tapes with Duncan Williamson, and Heather's on a big project where she's working on recordings of Stanley Robertson, who is another amazing Scottish traveller. So welcome, Heather. Hooray! Boop, 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 boop. So we also have the fantastic Joseph Sobol, who is currently from the George Ewart Evans Centre for Storytelling. He is the director of storytelling there. But tonight he is not representing Wales and Cardiff, who do have Jack stories, but not really as much maybe as England and Scotland and America. So Jason will be representing America, who have loads and loads and loads of Jack tales, their own special take on them. And he came to Cardiff via the East State Tennessee University, where he was teaching the masters in storytelling. So I've got very erudite guests tonight. I hope you appreciate the quality that I have gathered for you tonight. And also have the wonderful Mike Rust. Now, Mike Rust is here for England today, in English storytelling, and has been involved in English storytelling forever. He was mostly responsible for getting me started in the very beginning when I first started when I was 14. He ran one of the only pretty much story round in England, which I was very lucky that happened to be about half an hour from my house, so I was able to go and start storytelling. He was founder member of Society for Storytelling, Festival of the Edge, and now Get a Word in Edgeways. There's lots more things I could tell you about him, but I want to talk about Jack, so I'm not going to. So welcome to my fabulous, fabulous guests tonight. Hooray! Woo! Now, I've introduced you to my guests, and I am going to let them speak in a little bit, but I've kind of got a fifth guest here tonight who is the extra guest at all of the taking on the traditions, because it all really comes back to him. So I wasn't sure what stories I was going to tell tonight. I had this great idea of having a Jack Cayley, inviting all these people to come. And I started thinking what I might tell. And I realised that the Jack stories that I have from Duncan wouldn't fit, even though we've made it 2 hours instead of 1 hour. The Jack tales that I know about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour. And I thought, oh no, what am I going to do? Duncan, I need a story. And I picked on a recording at random that wasn't labelled, that I hadn't archived yet. And the first thing I heard was Duncan saying, the thing that you need to know about Jack is so, and he gave me a story. So that's the story that I'm going to tell in a little while. But I've just taken a little bit of him talking about Jack, and I think he's the person who should really kick this off. So let's see if I can get this up and play it to you.
After 50 years of collecting folk tales through many parts of Scotland, the character who comes most important in all these folk tales is Jack. A Jack tale. Now, Jack in Scotland was a local folk hero. But who was he? Where did he come from? Because the simple explanation is, we have stories Jack lived with his mother. Jack didn't have any sisters. We always get stories that Jack, he didn't have any sisters. He probably had 2 brothers. The stories for Jack was the fool. Jack was the hero. Jack was loved by the king. In different construction of stories, Jack was a handsome hero who worked for the king. In other constructions of stories, he was foolish. He was a fool, but not a fool as people would think he was a fool. Where did Jack come from? Who was he? Why was his mother always important? Why do we not hear about Jack, his father? Why about Jack's sisters? Why was Jack an important name? Because Jack is only another name for John. But it was always Jack. Fathers wanted their sons to be called Jack. Well, this is a thing that we're going to try to discover tonight by storytelling. This hero could be a fool, he could be clever, he could be big, he could be strong, he could be anything, but especially in Scotland and in Britain as a whole. We want Jack to be exceptional. There are many Jacks in this world. There are Boot Jack, there are Car Jack, there are Jack and Jill, and you can go on and explain hundreds and hundreds of Jack. Why was all these things always called Jack? Because Jack was important in the stories, and that's why. So now I'm going to tell you a Jack story. My story took you to Jack a long time ago, out in the Western Isles, and Jack lived with his mother. We have no mention of his father. His mother had a little croft out in the Western Isles, well out in the country, far from the nearest village. And there Jack was born and reared up with his mother in this little farm.
So that's Duncan talking a little bit about Jack, and there are many Jack tales that are recorded from Duncan, and you might hear a couple of them tonight, but on my tongue rather than his tongue. If you do want to hear more of Duncan Jack stories, you can go to Kist of Riches and Toba Al Dukas and listen there. But I'm not going to make you just sit and look at lots of lines going up and down and listening to Duncan tonight, because we're going to talk about Duncan and Jack. And I thought maybe just kick off by just going round and asking everybody, all the storytellers here. I'm assuming that most of the people listening, you're here because you're interested in Jack, but I don't know how much all of you know about Jack. I'm sure there are some experts here, but there may be some people who don't know so much about Jack as a character and here to find out a bit more. So I'm just going to ask everybody just a sentence of kind of what Jack means to you and what you think sort of typifies a Jack tale. So Joseph, why don't you kick us off?
Well, I might get more than a sentence here, but Jack is one of those characters in folklore who magnetizes a huge amount of floating folklore material from all kinds of traditions. And the name goes back to John or Johannes, which means in the original Hebrew, it means God is gracious. So in a sense, and I'll leave it here for the moment, Jack is a sign for the grace of God.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
No.
That's fantastic. Right. Heather, follow that. Sorry.
I don't know. Well, I remember, and I said that I spoke to you, Amy, about this, is that one time I normally never recreate or write stories, but I had to do a project for a Clarsach ensemble at the festival in Edinburgh, and I based the story on a Jack tale because, you know, it's a good structure and I love Jack. So I did that, and then I got a comment later on, some parent going, "Oh, for goodness sake, why does it have to be Jack? Why doesn't it, can't it be Jane or Jill or, you know, Fiona or something?" And I was quite shocked because I never really, I know that there, you know, Jack is a male character and he is a hero, but to my mind, he's everyone's hero. He's the journey. He's a life, what happens to him is a life journey. And I sort of feel that that's kind of a journey that we all take, whether you're Jack or you're Janine or Sarah or whatever. So to me, it's about the journey, and that's Jack.
Yeah, there's a line in one of your mother's articles about Ray Hicks where Ray says, anybody can be Jack. He says, it takes Jack to live.
Mm. Okay, Mike, your turn.
Well, I've got this saying that I keep to myself. It's just in my head when I'm telling you, never take the Jack out of Jack. Because Jack for me, well, first off, I better start off by saying this, Joseph, because Jack is a true Englishman. He comes from the Shires of England, right? And my Jack does anyway.
Okay, yours does.
And he leaves home reasonably early. Now, in the good old days, a 5-year apprenticeship was 10,000 hours. That's how it works. 40 hours a day for 5 years is 10,000 hours. And over in his apprenticeship, he learned his trade. Now, we can have a discussion about what his trade is, but for me, he's a countryman. He's a countryman from the Shires of England. And so he can lay hedges and he can build gates, he can mend roads, he can turn his hand pretty much to anything, a jack of all trades. So that's how, and his character comes from that. The strength and his confidence comes from the fact that he's good at stuff. Now, the stuff changes from time to time within the stories, but he's very rarely, when I'm talking about him or telling stories about him, not confident. So I've got a confident Jack who's not, you know, he's not gone to a university, he hasn't had much traditional schooling maybe, he can read and write and he can certainly do arithmetic in his head. He's good at deals and buying bales of straw and, you know, wheels for tractors or whatever it is. This all comes alongside it. But the whole basis of him gives him a confidence within his own skin.
Yeah.
Which I think is important. So that's how I see him, actually. Okay.
So I would say, and I mean, you know, you're welcome to join into this on the chat as well, because I think everybody's going to pick a little bit of it. You know, when you hear a jack tale, you go, yeah, that's a jack tale. And you might hear somewhere the main character's called Jack, and you think, yeah, it wasn't really a jack tale though. But there's, for me, I mean, he is a trickster. He's got that real kind of way of looking at things, and he's always going to get the better of a deal. He always starts in a settled family, though the Jack I know is kind of the hero of the travellers, and he's like, Duncan would certainly talk about that thing of him being held up to traveller children as a way to live, as a role model. And yet I don't know any stories where Jack is a traveller. He always starts in a settled family, usually with his mother, and then takes to the road. And I think one of the things that I think is quite crucial about Jack is that he's not afraid to be stupid. He's not afraid to look like a fool. And often he's described as a fool. And he doesn't take the usual path. And he understands all of the story rules. So he is kind, he is generous, he has a really strong moral compass. He always does what he thinks is right, but it's what his heart says is right, not what the law says is right. So he's quite happy to not pay his taxes or break rules or, you know, go poaching, but he wouldn't leave an old woman to starve by the side of the road. And he won't take the path that everybody takes. So, you know, he wins the day because everybody else has done what they think they're supposed to do, and they've gone and fought the dragon or whatever. And he's going, well, nobody's going to fight that dragon. They're not going to win. Might be able to poison it possibly, and he's quite happy to stand back while everybody calls him a coward and to think about it, and that's it. And like you said, he's confident, he's comfortable in his own skin, and he can give everything away because he can trust himself. He's got that innate trust in himself that he will find a way to do what needs to be done.
So he's got a sort of traditional wisdom.
Yeah, a traditional wisdom, and just and like you said, confidence.
Yeah.
So we're going to have quite a lot of chat about Jack tonight and about those different aspects. And I think that he is subtly different. An English Jack tale is not always the same as an American Jack tale, and it's not the same as a traveller Jack tale. I think there are some key components that sort of do generally tend to be there, but he's not always the same character. And there's a lot of different aspects to him. And so I think I'm gonna give you plenty of time to talk later, but I thought, for once, I'm going to kick off and tell a story, because this is the story when I was going to Duncan, kind of going, I need a story for tonight. Which one should I tell? This is the one that came up, and it's a bit of a Jack prequel, really. I wouldn't say it's a full form Jack tale, but it's sort of a little bit about maybe what it's a sort of story of why Jack is who he is, I think. So Jack lived in the Western Isles with his mother, and they lived in just a tiny little cottage, just the two of them. And every day, Jack, he would walk the 2 miles or so into the village to go to school. And at the end of the day, he would come home. And Jack's mother, well, she would be working all the time trying to make ends meet. Her hands would always be busy, and she would take in washing, she would take in mending to earn a few pennies, to earn enough to keep body and soul together. And she had a little patch of land that she would be digging and working, and anything she could do, anything honest she could do, she would do. And she would usually, nearly always, manage to have something to give Jack for his tea when he came home from school. And after they'd had their tea, well, she'd save all the jobs that didn't involve her feet, but just her hands. And she would sit there sewing or spinning. And while her hands were busy, she would keep her tongue and her mind busy with Jack. And she would tell him the stories, and she would sing him songs. And the two of them would share their day until Jack's head began to droop, his eyes began to close, and it was time for him to go to bed. And so the years passed until Jack was about 12 years old. And he came home one Friday, and, well, that day there really wasn't very much on the table to eat. The soup was so thin it was pretty much water, and there were no bannocks and nothing to dip into it. And she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Jack, there's not much to eat tonight. But it's been a little bit hard lately, but I have had a little bit of payment now for a bit of sewing I've done, and I've scraped together all the coppers. And if you can go into town tomorrow, if you can go to the village store and you can bring me back some oatmeal and some tea, and then we'll have a decent feed tomorrow." Jack said, "No problem." And the next morning, his mother, she got all the little bits of coppers, the little scraps of coins, and she put them into the middle of a handkerchief, and she wrapped it and she tied it up and gave him the bundle to put in his pocket. And off Jack went. And he'd walked that walk so many times before. And he took the path that ran along the coast. And it was a grey day. It wasn't raining, but the sea as he looked out was grey, with just the white tips of the waves, and the grey sea melded and melted into the grey sky with just the white scudding clouds, and the gulls, those grey too, with just the white flash occasionally of the underside of their wings. They were wheeling and screaming and crying on the wind as Jack made his way towards the village. And about halfway there, he came to the path, the bit of the path that was opposite the rock, and the tide was out. And the rock, it was where all the gulls gathered. It was a rock that was just a little way out at sea. And well, when the tide was high, it was completely cut off from the land, and the waves would wash against it. And it rose up out of the sea, and it was full of nooks and crannies that were perfect for all the gulls to make their nests and to lay their eggs. But when the tide was out, well, then you could walk across to the rock, and he could walk all the way around it pretty much. And well, Jack had skinned up to the top of that rock and back down many's the time. But this particular day, out on the shore on the sand and the shingle, there was a man. And the man had a stand in front of him, and on that stand he had a board, and in one hand he had a gull's egg that had cracked open, and in the other hand he had a paintbrush, and he was dipping the paintbrush into the yolk, and he was taking the pigment and he was painting that grey sea and the grey sky and the rock and the seagulls wheeling in the sky. And Jack stood and he watched for a little while. And he looked at the painter painting, and he saw the pile of cracked eggshells on one side and the pile of entire eggs on the other side. And something felt a little bit wrong. And he walked past the artist and he went to the rock. And he climbed up just a little way, and all the lower nests, they were empty, every single egg taken out. And Jack walked slowly back across the sand, and he peered over the artist's shoulder, and the artist nodded but didn't say anything. And then Jack carried on his way to the village. But all the way he was walking, he was thinking, and he wasn't happy. When he came into the village, and he went to the village door, and he opened the door and the bell jangled, and he went up to the desk, and there was Maggie, and she had a smile on her face. Maggie never had any of her own children. She knew all the children in the village and roundabouts, and well, Jack, he was one of her favourites. And she said, "Hello, Jack, how are you doing today? How's your mother?" "Oh, she's fine, said Jack. She sent me to get some oatmeal and some tea." "All right. Well, hand over your money and I'll start weighing it out. And I bet she said that you can have a bit of a penny for something for yourself as well, hasn't she?" And well, Jack's mother had said that, but Jack didn't admit it. But even so, well, Maggie, she weighed out the oatmeal and she weighed out the tea, and she put a couple of sweets into that pack as well for Jack, and then she bundled it up and Jack took it. And she said, "Jack, you've not said 2 words since you've been in here. What's wrong? There's something's upset you." And then out it came, about the rock and the gulls wheeling and the artist and the gulls' eggs. And he said, "No, I've taken eggs from there loads of times, Maggie, but well, I've taken them to eat, and I would only ever take one from a nest. And he's emptied the nests. He's left nothing for the gulls, and they're wheeling and they're screeching." And Maggie looked at him and she said, "He's really upset you, hasn't he?" He said, "Well, I don't think it's right." Said Maggie. "Well, I tell you what, I think I'll shut up a little bit early today. I've been wanting to catch up with your mother anyway." And so the two of them, they walked out of the shop together, and Maggie, she turned the sign from open to close. She shut the door behind her, and the two of them, they walked back on that path until they came to the rock. And the tide was still out, and the artist was still there. And Maggie and Jack, they walked over, and Maggie was peering over the artist's shoulder to have a look at the painting, and with an adult there, when the artist turned round and he smiled and he said, "Oh, good afternoon. Would you like to have a look? What do you think?" Said Maggie. "Well, that gull's not very good. It's flying all wrong." "Oh, what do you mean?" said the artist. "What do you know about painting? Do you think you could do any better?" "Nothing probably could," said Maggie, "because its wings are all completely wrong. And she looked at it, and she held up her hands and she crossed the thumbs, and she began to wave her hands together. And that gull in the corner, it started to wave its wings, and then it flew up, out of the painting, out and up into the grey sky, getting bigger as it went until it joined all of the other gulls wheeling and screeching in the sky. And the artist, he stood there with his mouth open, he looked at it and said, "What sort of woman are you? And what have you done? And what have you got about my painting? Why have you destroyed my painting?" "I've not destroyed your painting," said Maggie, "but you've taken a lot of lives to that painting. I just set one of them free." And she pulled her coat around her, and she picked up the 2 eggs, the only 2 eggs that were still entire from by the side of the artist, leaving the pile of the cracked eggshells behind. And she said, "Come on, Jack, we'll take these 2 home to your mother to keep them warm tonight. We'll bring them back in the morning when he's gone." And with her back straight as a poker, she stalked off across the beach, back to the path in the direction of Jack's mother's house. And Jack took one last look at the artist, and he smiled, and he turned, and he walked after Maggie. So I would say that's kind of a prequel, Jack, because I mean he hasn't left home, which is quite unusual for Jack, and but I do think, and some people would totally disagree with this, and I'm putting too much of myself and too much of other things into it. I think his mother is a really important character. And I think those kind of early years where he's just brought up by his mother, the father's never around, there's usually just the 2 of them. And if there is a couple of brothers around, Jack's always the youngest. So the other 2 are the 2 that are off playing, and he's the one that's kind of, in the ashes by the fire and sort of in the kitchen with his mother, and he's the one who's listening to all the stories. And he might not look very much, but he's taking it all in, and he's starting to get that kind of those moral values and that way of looking at the world. So yes, my first Jack story, I loved it. Must try and remember to tell it to your horses. Please do, Erica, tell it to your horses. That would be great. And it is a very sort of different Jack story. So thank you. I'm glad you all enjoyed it. So thank you for all the lovely comments on the chat. But yes, do dive in with comments about Jack as well. So that is my person. That's sort of where I'm coming from with Jack. But feel free to wade in and tell me that I am completely wrong. Just one quick, yes, I don't think you can find that story in writing, Erica. I don't know if it's written down anywhere. I don't think it's one of the ones that Linda published. So I've never seen it written down. I've only ever heard that one from Duncan.
I've never seen it written down.
No.
So he's 12 and he's living with a single mum.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's no benefits or state benefits or anything like that. And she's always at home when he leaves, and she's always at home when he comes home again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in this instance, she has a croft. It's always a small farm or a croft or a cottage in the country, which is where I get he's a countryman from.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? And and he'll have taken eggs. I'm not sure. I'll probably put it in that time, but I mean, he's taken eggs. One of the reasons that he's a bit conflicted about that is he's taken eggs from there lots of times to eat, but he would only ever take one from a nest. He wouldn't take the whole thing, and that's the key thing. It's that wanton thing of taking all of the babies and leaving those parent gulls crying with absolutely nothing. Taking one from each is a little bit different.
Yeah, it's that traveller thing of nature. You respect things. You have to. If you're pearl fishing, you don't strip the river. You just take what you need, and you want it to replenish. So it's the whole thing of living close to the land, isn't it? That's so important in that.
Yeah, that feels very much like a traveler kind of code story for how to treat the world, how to treat the environment. And you don't find that so much in the Appalachians, although, in some of the discourses that somebody like Ray Hicks would put into the story, you'd find that as commentary or as framing for the story. But that story is very particular to the traveling people.
I would say it's absolutely person to the Travellers, and although I do know quite a lot of English Jack stories, obviously I sort of studied with Duncan, and my perspective of Jack is absolutely, you know, focused on Duncan really, and that traveller perspective, and that's kind of, and that environmental theme. I think, yeah, as Sam Jukes saying, yeah, Jack is of the land, and for the Travellers, he's absolutely got that whole environmentalist theme coming through, but that isn't necessarily the same in other cultures at all. So yeah. but you were saying that, I mean, Stanley said similar things about Jack, weren't you, Heather?
Yes, though it's interesting, there are some differences about, you know, just what Mike was saying earlier about Jack being confident. I don't think that's always the case. I mean, that was something Stanley talked about a lot, was the different aspects of Jack, that there's thousands of Jacks, and that some Jacks are simple Jacks. He thought of them as kind of maturity. It was like you had Jack Tales, like you're saying, that was a sort of prequel, that there were some Jacks, you'll get the silly Jacks, the Jacks that really don't have much, they're not confident, they're not kind of worldly, but they learn. And then you get the sort of cleverer Jacks, and then you get the trickster Jacks. So you have all these. And my mum wrote an article once for some paper for that she called The Many Faces of Jack, and I've always liked that image. To me, that's a kind of that there are different Jacks, and sometimes that's the fun of it, is that you.
Yeah, I quoted Stanley from one of her papers, where he says, you know, Barbara, I never thought of Jack being the same person, but when you bring it up to me like that, there are thousands of stories, and the laddie's always cried Jack. He's never the same in any of the stories. So I think of him as Jack of a thousand faces. So Stanley was in touch with his Joseph Campbell. But I think that's a brilliant description.
Definitely. But and also, and in fact, later, you know, at whatever point in this, I'll be telling a Jack tale, and it won't be Jack. I've got some ones from Stanley that there isn't a mother, there's actually a father figure. So that sort of breaks that kind of rule. But there's still women in there causing mischief.
I think that's the thing, though, isn't it? I think we are all people who have spent our lives finding out about Jack and learning Jack stories and having Jack sort of threaded through our lives. So that when we sort of started talking about what we might do, we picked all of the odd ones out, the exceptions that prove the rule, and we all came with like completely like not classic Jack tales at all, which I think is really quite interesting. And it's sort of but I mean, he's one of those characters that I mean, for people who don't know about storytelling, they still know about Jack, you know, and it's sort of one of those nursery rhyme stories. Jack and the Beanstalk is the one that everybody knows, and everybody goes, oh god, not Jack and the Beanstalk. But actually, that's quite a classic Jack story, really. Vixie's saying Jack is a rascal. He absolutely is. I mean, you know, he has his own moral code, that's saying, so he has no problem stealing from giants, you know. That's like a whole different issue, and it's sort of and I think giants can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people, but there's a reason generally in a story that you want to steal from them. And that whole thing about the fool, even the innocent Jack, he's the one that kind of through his innocence is the one that wins the day anyway, because he just sees the world in a different way. And he might be portrayed as being a fool, but he also just cuts through all of the rubbish, all of the politics, to see how things really are. You know, he is a little bit like, you know, I'm sure if you asked what the boy in The Emperor's New Clothes, that the little boy at the end who says, but he's got no clothes on, that would be Jack. You know, it's kind of, it would have to be Jack as a child, wouldn't it? But I'm just sort of checking what time it is. I mean, do you want to tell that story now without the mother? Me having done the mother and everything, do you want to do the father's point of view, Heather?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, I mean, it was difficult to choose a story. And also Stanley has many a story that is also very, very long. But this one, I just like it for many reasons. And I think there's a lot of layers in it, a lot of kind of messages that can come through to different people. So yes, this story happened a while back, and there was a king, and he ruled over a large kingdom. And it was a prosperous, happy place. The people there were very happy and all was good. Now, the king had one son, and this lad was called Jack. And the king just adored Jack. He just doted on his son. He just thought he was the best lad ever. And, you know, he just, as they say in Scotland, you know, he wouldn't even let the wind blow upon him. He was just tried to keep the harshness of life away from him. But Jack grew up a good lad. He was clever, he was handsome, and he was good-hearted. And he kind of got fed up sometimes of his dad fussing over him, but he knew that that was just the way of his father. And it didn't go to his head. Now, when Jack was a young man, the king decided that it was maybe time for him to step back, maybe a time for him to retire and make Jack the king. And he said, you know, I'm getting older and I'd quite like to have a wee bit of time to putter about and maybe go fishing. And you would make such a good king. You've got a good head on your shoulders, laddie. And so that's what I'm thinking. So he made it known to the court and to the people that that was the plan. Now, the kings back in those days, they always had magicians and sages, you know, wise men there at the court to advise them. And so did this king. And he had one of the magicians. Jack didn't like him. There was something about this man. There was just a kind of feeling that Jack had that this magician was quite evil, the way he would slink about the corridors. And Jack was sure that he was planning something, some sort of treachery. He was just waiting, biding his time. But the king liked him, and so there was nothing Jack could do about it. And this magician, he hated Jack. Oh, he loathed the sight of him, mostly because he had a son too that was about the same age as Jack. But they were like chalk and cheese. I mean, they were the opposites. Jack was handsome and clever. Everyone loved him. Whereas the magician's son was a big lump of a laddie. I mean, he was just, he was nae bonny looking. I mean, he had coarse red hair. He was kind of spotty and lumpy. And he was always going about the castle with bits of chicken and ham and food. He was always stuffing his face with food. And in fact, he had gotten the nickname Hanging Face for all the bits of fat that were hanging off of his jowls and just kind of like rocking back and forth. So everyone knew him as Hanging Face. And so whenever the magician saw Jack, he couldn't help but compare the two laddies. And so he just hated Jack for that. Well, it came close to the time when there was the proposal for Jack to take the throne. And that magician, one night, he put a curse on Jack. And while Jack slept, the flesh from Jack's face melted off of his face. And he was left just with two eyes and his hair on a skeleton, on a skull. Well, when he got up in the morning, Jack started putting on his clothes. He was half asleep. He wasn't really paying much attention. And then he suddenly realised there was someone in his room, and he looked over. And what should he see? But he saw a form, a shape that looked exactly like himself, sitting there in his room. He said, "Who are you?" And the form, the shape, looked at him and said, "I'm Jack, I'm the prince. This is my bedroom. What are you doing here, you strange, bony-faced creature? What are you doing in my room?" "Guards!" he shouted. The guards came running. And behind them, after a while, came the king, wondering what the commotion was about. And Jack saw the king turn to this form, this creature that looked like him, and say, "Son, what's the matter? What's wrong?" And this form turned and pointed at Jack and said, "Look at this hideous creature that has come into my room." And the king looked at this skull and this and said, "What are you doing here? Get out of my castle. You shouldn't be here." And Jack said, but I'm your son. I'm Jack. The king said, no, you're not. That's my son, that handsome young man there. Not this monster that you are. No. Guards, take him out of the castle. The magician had arrived by this point, and he said, oh, I think you should do away with his life. You should kill this creature. After all, he's in your son's bedroom. He might have been meaning great harm to the prince. Oh, there's no need for that, said the king, but we'll banish him. He's not allowed back here. And so Jack was dragged from the room. He was dragged out of the castle and thrown out of the front gate. Well, when people saw his face, his fearsome appearance, they ran screaming in all directions. They were so horrified by the sight of this skeleton. And Jack didn't know what to do. I mean, this was just, he was so horrified at this. These are the people that loved him and usually greeted him with joy and welcoming. And there they were running and screaming and crying away from him. He looked around and there were some baskets lying against a wall. He picked up a basket, put over his head. But he couldn't stay in the town because people were pointing and shouting at him, monster, monster, and they were throwing things at him. He thought, I don't know what to do. He had nothing with him. He had no food, he had no money, he had nothing. I thought, well, I have to go away from here. I have to go out into the country and I'm going to have to beg the houses for my living. There's nothing for it. So he went and he walked along the road. And after a while, he came to a wood and he started walking through the woods and he was trying to forage for something to eat, but he couldn't find anything. He spent the night there and in the morning, oh, he was starving and he was just full of so much sadness and despair. Well, he kept on walking. He came out of the wood and there was a little cottage, a beautiful sort of old-fashioned kind of thatched cottage. And he thought, well, I'm going to have to ask for some food and hopefully they'll be kind to me. So he went up and he chapped the door. The door opened and there was a lovely young woman and she smiled at him and she said, what can I do for you? And why do you have a basket over your head? And Jack said, well, I'm so ugly. I'm so hideous. I have to hide my face from the world. But I just wondered if you had just even a couple of crusts of bread, something. I'm just starving. And she said, well, come away and I'm not going to just give you a crust of bread to eat. I won't let a hungry traveller pass my door without a full belly. Come away in. And she cooked him something and she gave Jack this plate of food. And he took the plate and he turned and faced the corner of the room with his back to her and he ate the food. And then he came back to the table and they sat there and they talked and they got on really well together and they were blethering away for a while. And then the girl said, look, why don't you take that basket off? He said, no, I'm absolutely hideous. I'm terrifying. I would scare you. And she said, look, I live here on my own. There's very little that scares me. Go on, take the basket off your head. And so eventually he did. And she looked at him and she said, aye, yeah, you have been cursed by the black arts. Oh, you've been sair done by, so you have. Aye, well, I knew you had something you're not ugly, you're not terrifying. But I think I can help you. I think I can make things a bit better for you. Go down to the river and wait there for me. I'll just be a couple of minutes. So Jack went out to the river and he stood there and he waited. And a couple of minutes later, she came back with a small spade and she started to dig and she dug into the riverbank until she came to the red mud, the red clay. And she said, come here. I'm going to make a face for you. And she started to put this red clay on to his face, and she started with her nimble fingers, she started delicately and softly creating a face. And she worked away for a while, and then she stood back and she looked and she said, aye, that's a good face. Folk will probably call you Jack o' the Clay. It's a strange face, but it's a good face. And that'll do you well. And she said, now, I need you to lie here along the river and let the sun bake that clay hard. And so she went away back into the house, and Jack did as she said. He lay down there on the river bank and he stayed there the whole day. And the sun baked that clay until it was hard as an urn, as hard as a pot. And then he went into the house. And she said, right, Jack, well, I've made you up a wee bed in the barn, and you're welcome to stay the night. And in fact, if you'd like to stay for a while longer, there's a lot of wee jobs that need to be done around this place. So you're very welcome. And so Jack stayed. He said, well, I'll stay for a few days, he said at the start of this, until I work out what to do and to get back to what I was. She said, what were you? And he said, I am the king. I'm the true king, son. But there's an imposter that's taken my place. And so I need to work out how to get rid of this curse so I can go back to what I was. She said, oh, right. Aye. Well, the days turned into weeks, and the two of them got on really well. They really liked each other. And in fact, over time, they fell in love with each other. And Jack said to her one day, oh, I would ask you to be my wife. I would ask you to be my bride, but I have nothing to offer you. I have nothing to offer at all. It's been taken away from me. Until I can sort things out and get my father to realise the truth and that I am his true son, I can't offer you a thing. But then after that, I'd be able to offer you the world. She said, there is one person that could help you with your problems. I said, who? She said, there's a man, an old man called the Master of the Mountains. And he is the one that could help you. He's the only person in the whole world. Where do I find him? Said Jack. Well, she said, 3 days walk from this house. You'll find the Master of the Mountains. So Jack was determined to go. And the next morning, she made him some food for the journey. And she said, Jack, it's 3 days walk along that road. Just keep on going down that road and you'll come to it. And when you've found the answer to your problems, come back here on your way home. And so he said he would. Well, he set off, and just as she said, after 3 days walk, there on the hillside, he saw this castle. Jack went up to the door and he knocked on the door, and the butler answered and asked him what he was after. He said, I would like to speak to the Master of the Mountains. So he was brought in front of the Master of the Mountains. And the Master of the Mountains looked at him and said, hey, you're a strange one with your face of clay. What are you wanting from me? And Jack said, well, I'm in search of the truth. I need to find out how to show my father that I am his true son. Well, said the Master of the Mountains, the only way I will help you is if you do something for me first. You have to work for a year and a day for me. And if you do that and work hard and you do well, then I will help you. If you're lazy and neglect your work, then you'll be flogged and you'll be sent away with nothing. So Jack agreed to that bargain. And the Master of the Mountains took him to his garden. He said, this is my vegetable garden. It's my pride and joy. And I want you to look after it. And if you work hard and you do a good job, then I will help you. And so he left Jack there. Well, it was an amazing garden. It was very large, a lot of work it was gonna take to look after this place. But there was a wee cottage there in the garden, and it was a lovely, lovely place to be. And Jack immediately started working. He started weeding and sorting out things. And he worked hard that day. And at the end of the day, he was tired, and he sat in front of the cottage and looked out over this garden, and he was fair chuffed with himself and what he'd accomplished on that day. But as he was sitting there, what do you think he saw? Coming from all directions, but dozens and dozens of rabbits. And they came charging into the garden. And Jack leapt up and he grabbed a stick and he started chasing the rabbits away from everything. Oh, they were into everything. They were chewing away at the cabbage and they were mucking about the French beans. And oh, it was just shambles. And Jack was running about. And he ran round and round that garden chasing those rabbits for like 2 or 3 hours. And then suddenly, they were gone. Well, he got a wee bit of sleep that night, and then he was up again and worked the day. And what do you know? Dusk fell and those rabbits all came back again. And he was chasing them round, and he was thinking to himself, I can't keep doing this. I can't work in the garden all day and then chase rabbits all night. I won't last a year and a day. So he thought, I'll make a trap. I'll see if I can catch some of those rabbits. So he made a trap. And the next night when he was chasing the rabbits, he heard the trap go, the sound of it. And he thought, I've got something in the trap. I'll go and see what's there. And he went to have a look. But there were no rabbits. Inside was a great big futterick. And a futterid is the Scots word for a ferret. And this ferret was sitting inside the trap. And Jack was going to kill it. And the ferret looked at him and said, please, Jack, don't kill me. I'm not doing any harm. I'm not causing any trouble. And Jack said, but you're eating the vegetables. You're causing a havoc in the garden. And the ferret laughed and said, I don't eat vegetables. Don't be daft. I'm not going to eat the vegetables here. But look, if you save my life, I will be a help to you. I'll do whatever you need done. In fact, I can help you with your rabbit problem because, as they say, if you've got a ferret, then you won't see a single rabbit. And that's true. Rabbits do not like ferrets. They're terrified of them. So that was the bargain was struck. And so from that day on, Jack worked in the garden during the day and his new friend took care of the garden at night and kept the rabbits away. And the two of them got on really well. It was good to have a bit of company for Jack. And the weeks passed and the months until it was a year and a day. And the Master of the Mountains came into the garden and he looked around. He said, Jack, oh, Jack, you've done a great job. Fantastic job. So I can help you now. And Jack said, well, I had a friend to help me. And he showed him the ferret. The Master of the Mountain laughed and said, it's my pet futterick. I didn't realise he was here all the time. And I'm glad you had somebody to help. Now, what do you need from me? And Jack said, I need some means of showing my father the truth, of showing him that I am his true son and that the imposter is who he's sitting beside him in the castle. And the Master of the Mountain said, well, then you need the mirrors of truth. And he pulled out of his pocket it was 2 mirrors that were kind of joined together with a piece of cloth. And the Master of the Mountain said, when you see the reflection in one side, it's the reflection of who you're seeing there, just as they are. But then the other side is the true person. And this will prove to your father who you really are. And you know something, Jack? Your father's no daft. He is still the king. He's not given up his throne. He knows something's wrong. He knows that there's something odd because he's never had a son before that has never smiled or laughed and goes around eating all the time. No, there's something odd about the laddie that he has beside him. So he knows something's not right. Jack thanked the Master of the Mountains for the mirrors and away he went. And of course, as he came past, the wee cottage. He stopped there, and the lassie was so glad to see him. And Jack said, I've got this. I can prove to my father the truth. So I want you to come with me because I want you to be my bride. I know that you're just a common poor lass, but I want you to be my wife. I love you. And she smiled at him and said, oh, well, thank you, Jack. I want to be your wife too. I've always loved you, and I love you with your face of clay or in whatever form. I will come with you. So the two of them made their way to the castle. Now, when they got there, Jack said to the guards at the front, announce Jack O'Clay wants to speak to the king. And so they went to the king, and the king was puzzled. He said, Jack O'Clay? I've never heard of this man. Who's this? And when Jack came in the room, the king was puzzled because this man coming in had the form of his son and had this clay face that looked just like his son, Jack. And then the king turned and he looked, and there beside him sat Prince Jack. And he looked and said, who are you? And Jack of the clay said, I am your true son, and I have something here to prove it to you. And he showed the king the mirrors. And the king looked at the reflection of Jack in the mirrors. In one side, he saw this clay face, and in the other, he saw his son, and he knew his son. And just then, the magician came out from the crowd and said, oh, that's nonsense, magic, fakery. But the king turned those mirrors to the laddie sitting beside him. And in one side, he saw his son's face, and the other side, he saw the face of Hanging Face, the magician's son. And he said, oh, you have put your son here beside me. You've tricked us all, magician. Guards, take them away. But the magician stood tall and he looked at everyone and he smiled, this evil smile. He said, I was going to wait until you put my son on the throne, and then I was going to rule from behind the throne. I was going to control the whole of the kingdom. But I can destroy you all. I am powerful. I know all the black arts. I have more power than anyone else. No man in this castle or in this place can stop me. And they knew that was true. No man in that castle could stop him. And just then, the lassie standing beside Jack stepped forward, and she said, you say that no man can stop you. And the magician turned to her and said, peasant lass, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be speaking in front of men. This is no place for you. Go and be quiet in the corner. And she just smiled and she said, you say that no man can stop you, but I am a woman and I can stop you. You're talking nonsense. You're just a pathetic young lassie. What are you saying? Said the magician. I am the daughter of the master of the mountains, she said, and I know all the arts, but I've been trained to use them for good and not for evil, to fight against people like you. And so I can challenge you. I can fight against you. And you know well that if there's any strain or power put against me, my father will feel it and he will be here in an instant. And there is no way that you can work against, you can defeat the master of the mountain and his daughter. And the magician knew he was beaten. He knew that there was nothing he could do about that. She had defeated him. And so they were sent away, the guards took them away, and they were banished from the kingdom, never to be there ever again, the magician and his son. And Jack turned to the lassie and said, I thought you were just a poor common girl. And she smiled and said, aye, I know you thought that, but no, I am a princess. And together we can rule this kingdom. And I was schooled, I was being in training just from my father was having me work on my schooling, and that's why I was in that wee cottage. But I'm finished. I've completed this training, and so together we will have a wonderful kingdom. We will have children that are going to be wise and clever, because I'll be able to school them in all the arts. But before that, she said, the clay face, and she got a bowl of water and a clean cloth. And she said, there never was anything wrong with your face. It was just an illusion. I could see you as you truly were. And I just put a thin layer of clay on your face just to make you feel confident and feel like you could take that basket off and you can get on and sort out what you needed to do. And so she wiped the clay from his face. And there he was, as handsome as ever. And the two got married and they lived a long, happy life.
Wow.
Yay!
That was long.
Oh, well, I think a lot of the Jack stories are. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, they often are really good, meaty, wonderful stories. Now, I think we're just going to sit with that story because it's such a great story. I think we should just let it settle. It's 9 o'clock and just take 5 minutes break. So if you want to have a stretch, some great comments on the chat. I don't know if you've already seen talking about these while I nipped out, but have you read these comments on the chat, Heather? They're really fab. But I mean, to hear about the face covering, so interesting that just yesterday saw a story about an artist. Have you already been talking about this while I wasn't here?
No.
So I saw a story about an artist in Paris after World War I who made masks for the returned soldiers disfigured in battle. And, and just that whole thing, about, Norman saying, how can we get our fathers to truly see us? And that we've got to be able to see ourselves first to do that.
There's a lot of different layers and ways you can interpret that. But that's what I like about that. There's another story that Stanley does, which is actually the lassie has a mask because she's disfigured by the devil, and she's given a golden mask until the curse is lifted. And that idea of not being able to cope with disfigurement or whatever, and it's very powerful.
Yeah, it's very much about psychological growth, and that feels very resonant with who Stanley was.
Yeah.
As a person, I think
spread that out into the more modern world. Victoria Beckham, she went to her husband because the people who have cancer and chemotherapy, all the hair fall out. And she found out about it. She started a wig company, and so it's particularly the teenagers that have cancer and all the hair falls out. She turns up with some wigs, so when they leave the hospital ward, they go out looking as best as they can. And when she runs out of money, she goes, "Oi, pal, give me some more money." And he does, by all accounts. And I thought, just as bring it up into the modern and go back into the traditional tales, Heather, just giving youngsters the confidence sometimes.
Well, there's another comment here from Rita, who's a nurse and has been working really hard, not in this country, but in Antwerp, and about... So she wrote a story over a soldier whose face was shot off, and he was one of the first who didn't get a face mask and made that decision, to not have a mask and to go out and to show that what had happened to his face and to live with that and to make other people live with it as well.
That's quite hard. It's courageous, actually. It's a different way of, I think, but I think with this story, it is that idea of the psychological as well.
Absolutely.
And the perception, a lot of times people just decide that you are something, it's that kind of, it's what we're battling with in many ways in so many places at the moment, is what people immediately assume of you. And it's also to do with, sometimes your accent or the way you say things. People make assumptions, and so there's a lot there.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the things as well. So you were talking about Stanley and Jack of 1,000 faces. I think in lots of ways, there's as many Jacks as there are people, because he is a reflection of everybody. Like you were saying, he is the everyman, and Stanley saying that kind of, you know, that whole thing of somebody going, why isn't there a Jane, you know, why is it always Jack? And there is something about Jack that you identify, well, I and you obviously, Heather, as well, identified with him, even though it's a male character. It's still that journey and kind of that story. It doesn't matter, but there's so many different takes on him because he's a reflection of you. Having said that, I think there is this thing of kind of, you know, if he's Jack of 1,000 faces, can you just put the name into and make it a Jack story?
Sometimes you can and sometimes you can't, is the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, if you can, there's a question of, can you? Of course. Do you want to? Probably not, because, you know, the world is wide and there's room for many different figures through which to experience it. And I think, you know, the Jack tale tradition is wonderful, but it's not all there is. There are many different traditions we need Coyote. We need all the different trickster figures in the Native American tradition. We need our own individual stories. The youngest daughter, yeah.
But I suppose what I meant as well, though, is kind of, are there some stories that just wouldn't work as a Jack story?
Yes.
Does it need to have certain elements to feel right, to feel in that place as a Jack story? And
it's the Northern European tradition, mainly. And, you know, different cultures have different names that incorporate some of those figures. It might be Ian in Scotland, or it might be the little tailor we were talking about before. It might be all kinds of different images that allow that culture to collect those stories under one sign. I think Jack works for certain language groups and certain cultural groups.
So Janice, who also knows a lot about Jack, so Janice Down Edgeways is saying, a quest or a task, some sort of journey, physical and other. And Elizabeth's going, don't all cultures have their Jack stories with different names? Ivan, for example, yes, and the little tailor, and Ian. That's sort of, I think, what Joseph was saying. But not all stories within a culture, I would say, are Jack stories. I know lots of stories that I would never occurred to me to put Jack into, because then, for me, they're not Jack stories. And I've said a little bit about at the beginning about what Jack stories mean to me. I think you know, so yeah, Jan's saying, if you wanted to write a type of Jack tale, what would you include? And they don't all have to be the same, but I think there is the trickster element is really important, and I think that comes up in so many things. I think that's sort of seeing, then this is just me, and I'm expecting it to be different. So that's seeing things in a clear way and being able to sort of cut through the rubbish on either side, and the morality of always sticking to that compass even when it's really difficult, and that thing of, you know, being able to give your food to the old woman when you have nothing in your pockets, when you have no money, that you can give away the last thing that you have and do it cheerfully, is such a common thing in stories that it's a throwaway line. And yet actually there's a lot of people in those kind of situations, I think, in the world today. You know, when you look at the refugees and people escaping from place to place, if you were in that position, could you do that? And I think most of us couldn't. I would struggle. I'm not sure I could do it. But that's taken for granted. And I think those are the three key things for me for Jack. But I'm interested, because I think the Appalachian Mountains, the American Jack, although he sort of went there from from sort of Scotland and England mostly, I think he's probably changed once he got there.
I think all the people that left the northern European countries and went to the New World, as we call it, sometimes still shows it, did change. The journey just changed them. So they weren't the same as they were over here. And that was a lot of the reason they went in the first place. There's an old saying over here, Joseph, that all the good ones left. But it's very true. So the stories would change as well for that reason. And they'd also change because they're in a different landscape.
Exactly. That might be a good cue to tell an Appalachian Jack tale, because you know, it's really striking how the the landscapes change, some of the family structures change, and the character of Jack becomes much more unmoored from the traditional family structures. He's pretty much on his own. In many, he's an orphan, but even if he has parents, he's very willing to leave them behind almost immediately and become his own sort of free agent wandering the roads. So I first encountered Jack Tales through the Richard Chase collection, which it really wasn't his collection. It was, he was kind of a rogue himself, Richard Chase. He went through the mountains, both collecting stories, but also he stole a bunch of them. Oops, start my video.
I'm so sorry, Joseph. Here's me trying to spotlight you and I turned you off. I'm very sorry. Oh. We're having a lovely picture of Heather. We're listening to you, but you know, I'm so sorry.
Heather's a lot better looking, actually. I was going to say that Heather, your story is kind of unfair to hanging-faced people, but okay. So I encountered Jack through the Richard Chase's book when I was in California, and then I came to North Carolina, as many people did before me, to encounter real American folklore. And that's where they sat me down in front of an old cassette deck and said, listen to this. And they put Ray Hicks on the machine there. And when I heard that voice, it sort of melted something in my brain and fused my synapses and reconfigured my root drive. And I started hearing stories very differently. And then I got to meet Ray and some of his family, Stanley and the Presnells and some of those folks. And Donald Davis, who came from about 70 miles southwest along the Blue Ridge in Haywood County, and learned a lot more about the tradition. And in Ray's family, which goes back to a fellow named Council Harmon, who was born around 1803, and sort of seems to have gotten the Jack Tale tradition solidified or crystallized as an Appalachian form, as opposed to, you know, German refugees and English immigrants and Scotch-Irish. And they all met together and they interbred in this little area of Beech Mountain. And there were about 12 or 13 of these stories. Ray used to call them the 12, like the 12 disciples. And then up the road a little bit in Southwest Virginia, there were some other stories that were a little different. And Chase's book wound up collecting about 18. And Donald Davis's book a few years later, that he published in around 1990, had maybe another 15 or 16 stories that he collected or adapted or reconfigured in his own way. And I think there's that mixture of tradition and creativity with a great storyteller. Somebody like Duncan or somebody like Stanley Robertson or Ray Hicks, who I heard Ray take the old kind of jokey story about the blacksmith and the devil, which Chase called Wicked John and the Devil, although it was originally a Jack tale too. It was an old Jack, and Chase didn't want an old Jack. He wanted all his Jacks to be young, strapping youths going out to seek their fortune. And so he called the old blacksmith Wicked John. But Ray took that story in which Wicked John was really wicked and was a real rogue and a drunk and a nasty fella. And he made him a special kind of hero who was too full of curses to go to heaven, but too full of love for his fellow man to go to hell. So he was like the Bodhisattva wandering the earth in Ray's version. And it was totally different than the version that he probably received from Chase. So I heard him tell this story. This is one of the first ones I heard him tell. And it's an old story that goes back to Beowulf and probably well before that, about the monster that interrupts the feast. So it's called, in Ray's version, it was called Old Fire Dragoman. See, once upon a time, Jack was living at the foot of the mountain with his two brothers, Will and Tom. And their father was in this story, but just long enough to throw him out. See, their father was poor, didn't have much food, didn't have much land. All he could say was, boys, if you go on up the mountain, find yourself some new ground that's never been cleared, build yourself a cabin up there, and make a living on your own. Come back in a while and show me how you've done. And so they did. They wandered away from home and they wandered up the mountain and they cut a path through the brush with a reaping hook, and they found a flat place near the top of the mountain, and they built a pole cabin, just a shack out of saplings with brush to roof it over. And every day, two of those boys would go out clearing and hunting food for the night, and the other boy would stay home and make the food for the boys returning from their work. And the first day, it was Will's turn to stay home. And he had a few squirrels in the pot. And he had some cornbread, some cornmeal that he made into bread, made into pones, and heated on the fire. And he had gravy in the pot, a boiling, bloop, 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 bloop. And when that meal was almost done, up the holler came the old fire dragon man. And he was a ferocious sight. He had a long blue beard down to his knees, tall stovepipe hat on top of his head, had a long briar pipe sticking out of his mouth and eyes like coals of fire. And he bent down to look through the door frame, and he saw Will, and Will saw the old fire dragon man. And he just went over backwards, jumped out the window, hid behind the wood pile, a-shaking. And the old fire dragon man said, nobody home. Good. And he reached a long, gnarly hand over to the fire. And he just grabbed the meat out of the pot, ate it down 2-3 big gulps, grabbed the cornbread out of the pan, mopped up all the gravy and ate that down. And then he reached into the fire with his bare hand and brought out a log of fire and stuck it in the end of that great big briar pipe, and whoosh, filled that whole room full of thick black smoke. And when the smoke had cleared, the old fire dragon man was gone. Well, Tom and Jack came back from the hunting with a couple of squirrels and some rabbits in a bag. But when they looked in, the room was still all smoky and soiled. And Will was out back behind the woodpile shaking. They said, what happened to our supper? He said, you wouldn't talk about no supper if you'd seen what I just seen. And they said, we don't see nothing, but the room is scorched. And he described the old fire dragon man to him. And they said, you made it up. Surely you just got hungry and ate up the dinner, and now you're just coming up with a story to protect yourself. And Will said, all right, Tom, tomorrow's your turn. See how you do. Well, sure enough, the next day, Tom stayed home. Will and Jack went off hunting and clearing land. And Tom had the supper all cooked. He had meat in the pot, gravy a blubbering, cornbread in the pan. Went up the holler came the old fire dragon man. Leaned down, looked through the door. Tom hid under the bed, a-shaking. And the old fire dragon man said, nobody home. Good. And he reached in, grabbed the meat out of the pot, ate it all up, grabbed the cornbread out of the pan, sopped up the gravy, ate that down. Then he reached his hand into the fire, took a log of wood and stuck it in the end of his pipe, and whoosh, filled that room full of thick black smoke. And when the smoke had cleared, the old fire dragon man had cleared out and gone. Now Will and Jack came back. They looked around. Will knew what was happening, but Jack said, you two are in this together. You're trying to starve me out like you always do. You're hiding the supper, or I don't know, but you just want to kill me and have it all for yourself. And they said, all right, Jack, tomorrow's your turn. See how you do. Well, the next day was, sure enough, it was Jack's turn to stay home. So he made the supper. He had the meat in the pot, gravy of blubber and cornbread in the pan. Went up the holler come the old fire dragon man. Leaned down, looked in the house, but Jack He wasn't scared. He was sitting at the table with his feet up there. The table they'd hewn out of fresh cut logs, and the chairs that they'd woven out of cane and green twigs. And he sat there and he looked at the old dragon man square in his burning eyes, and he said, "Well, howdy, Dad. Reckon you come for supper. So come on in, sit down. There's enough for all of us." But the old fire dragon man, now he'd never been talked to like this. He'd never been invited in any place in his life. And so he started shuffling his feet and looking at the ground and said, "No, thank you, Jack. Didn't come for no supper. Just come to light my pipe and I'll be gone." And he reached into the fire, grabbed a log of fire and stuck it in the end of his pipe. Whoosh, filled that room full of smoke. And then he took off down the holler. But Jack was interested by this point, and he decided to follow. So he followed the old dragon man. He followed the trail of smoke down to the river. And he saw where the old fire dragon man was climbing down between a hole and two big boulders. And he looked down, and it was dark. It was pitch dark down there. But he was excited now because he had a place to go. He had a quest to make. And so he went back up the mountain just in time to see Will and Tom finishing up the last of the supper that he'd made. And they said, "Oh, Jack, sorry, we didn't know you were still alive. We thought the old fire dragon man got tired of squirrel meat, ate you instead." Jack said, "Never mind that, boy." Said, "I saw where that old fire dragon man's going to, and I know where he's coming from. And if we go down there after him, we can find treasure." They said, "Treasure? We're all over it." So they went and they got a well bucket and a long twist of hempen rope, and they followed Jack down the mountain to the river, to that pair of boulders where the old fire dragon man had gone. And Jack took a rock and he dropped it down, heard it hit a long way down. But it was a long twist of rope. And Jack said, "I'll go down in this bucket and I'll find the treasure and you can pull me up." Will said, "Now, wait a minute. I'm the oldest brother. I should go first." They said, well, all right. Primogeniture and all that. Why not? So they put Will in the bucket, put his setter down there, and they scooted him over the edge of that hole, and they started feeding the rope down and feeding him down. And it wasn't long before that rope started shaking like a blazes, and they had to pull him up and up and up and up he came, just shaking like a leaf, pale as a ghost. They said, "What do you see?" He said, "Didn't see nothing down there. It was pitch dark. Couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I was scared." "All right," Tom said, "I'm the next eldest. Let me try." So they let Tom down in the bucket, and it wasn't long before that rope was just shaking, and they pulling him up, and here he comes, pale as a ghost. "What do you see?" "Nothing. Just I got scared." "Well," Jack said, "I'm the last eldest, next eldest, and here I go." And they put Jack in the bucket, and they started letting him down. And there was Jack, swinging down through that other world. Couldn't see the hand in front of his face, but he saw sparks of fire and little traces of smoke and flame coming up from down there, and all colors of the rainbow. And Jack saying, "Well, if you don't think about this too hard, it's kind of pretty." And he got down to where he could see the outline of a roof down in that other world, and he could see the ground a-glowing. And Jack just sort of steered that bucket till he could land on that roof, because it seemed like the safest place to drop. And then he put the bucket, lowered that down, and he lowered himself down, and he found himself standing in front of a door. And he said, "It didn't come all the way down here just to stand in front of no door." So he reached out his fist and he knocked on that door, expecting to meet the old fire dragon man face to face down here. But when the door swung open, there wasn't no fire dragon man at all, but the prettiest girl he'd ever laid eyes on in all his days. And he looked at her and she looked at him, and he said, "You're all the treasure I need." He said, "I got this bucket, see, and we can get out of here and we'll go courting in town on Saturday night and we'll have a big time." And she said, "Oh no," she said, "don't do that." He said, "Why not?" Said, "Because the next door yonder is my sister, and she's twice as pretty as I am. You want to ask her first." And Jack said, "What kind of strange other world is this where a girl talks up her own sister over herself? I wouldn't do that with my brothers, but I'll take your word this time." And he went next door and he knocked on the door, and the door swung open, and sure enough, there was a girl twice as pretty as the prettiest girl he'd ever seen. And he said, "All right, let's go. I got this bucket. We'll have a big time Saturday night, go to town, we'll court, we'll spark." She said, "Never mind." She said, "Don't do that." Said, "Why not?" "Because next door yonder is my sister, and she's 3 times prettier as I am." And Jack said, "Thank you very much. See you later." And he went to the next door and he knocked on the door, and the door swung open. And this time he was expecting a trick. He was half expecting the old fire dragon man to come barreling out of there, shooting balls of fire out of his mouth. But it wasn't. It was, sure enough, the prettiest girl, or a girl who was 3 times as pretty as the girl who was twice as pretty as the prettiest girl he ever seen. He said, "No more talk, no more bargaining, no more next door." Said, "You're the one. You're always been the one. I want you to get in this bucket, and my brothers will carry you out, and then they'll come for me." And she said, "Oh no, don't do that." "Why not?" "Because next door yonder's the old fire dragon man, and I hear him stirring. He'll be coming out of here shortly with balls of fire coming out of his mouth, ears, eyes, nose." Said, "You better take this sword." Said, "It looks kind of puny, but it's the sword of swiftness. It'll take the head off whatever's coming at you. And take this medicine bottle. It looks kind of cheap, but it's the balm of healing. It'll heal up whatever burns you, cuts you, makes you sore." Said, and here, take this. It's a wishing ring off my own finger, and look sharp, because here he comes." And out of that door came the old fire dragon man himself, with his long blue beard, his stovepipe hat, his eyes like coals of fire, his long briar pipe a smoking. And he came at Jack with balls of fire coming out his eyes, ears, nose, mouth, everywhere. And they were smart balls. Jack would dodge, but those balls would just, they had sonar. They'd hit him every time. And Jack was going down. He was burning up. He was sore, and he was weak. But he got that sword up, and he took one swing of that thing, and that sword just jumped right out of his hand. And the old fire dragon man's head rolled that way, and the rest of him rolled the other. Jack said, "That worked pretty good." That "I hope that medicine works as good, because I'm fixing to die here." And he took that medicine bottle out, and he just wiped it all over himself, and it just burned out all the burn and all the wounds, and Jack was feeling good as new and a little bit better. And he went to that third girl. He said, "Honey," his voice had dropped about 1.5 octaves during this whole experience. He said, "Honey, time for you and me to get gone." Said, "We'll make a pole cabin of our own. We'll start raising." She said, No, don't do that." He said, "Why not?" Said, "Because my 2 sisters over there, you got to send them up first." Sort of insurance for this whole thing. So Jack said, "Oh, all right." And he got the first girl, set her in the bucket, gave the rope a shake. Up, 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 up. She went out of sight. Bucket came down one more time. Got the second girl, set her in that bucket, gave the rope a shake. Up, 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 out of sight. Bucket came down one more time. Jack got that third girl, said, "Remember me." She said, "Remember me." And up, 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 up. She went out of sight. Now that bucket came down one more time, and Jack was fixing to get in it when he remembered his 2 brothers. And something about their character that just didn't sit right with him. And he said, "They might just drop that bucket halfway and leave me to rot down here." He said, "I'm going to test them." So he went and got the old fire dragon man's head, put that in the bucket, gave the rope a shake, and that bucket went up, 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 about halfway, sure enough, and then bam, down it came with the end of the rope following after. Jack said, I knew it. Them brothers of mine, they're just no good. They're just leaving me to starve down here." Said, "What am I going to do? There's nothing to eat, just that old fire dragon man and him already a stinking." Said, "I'm doomed." And Jack just sat down there in the middle of the yard and started pitying himself full time. Went into a major depression. Didn't move for about 3 days, until the end of that time, so much flesh had fallen off his bones that the wishing ring that he just happened to have stuck on his finger there was just turning round and round, turning round and round on his finger. He could just spin it. And that's what he was doing, just idly spinning that ring on his finger and thinking, oh, Lord, I wish. He was looking for something to wish. He said, I wish I wish I was sitting in my mama's chimney corner, smoking my corn cob pipe and eating a bowl of her good Southern style beans. And blam, there was a flash of light, and Jack was sitting in his mama's chimney corner with a bowl of beans in his lap and a corn cob pipe in his mouth. And he looked up, and Mama looked up and said, Jack, what you doing here? I thought you were up in the new ground with your brothers, Will and Tom, clearing new land. Jack said, that's just where I'm going, Mama, just where I'm going. He set the beans aside, threw the pipe down, ran up the door and up the mountain. And he got there just in time to keep Will and Tom from killing each other. They had their hands around each other's throats because they'd been arguing the whole time about which one would marry which girl. You know, there was 3 girls and 2 boys, and it just wasn't working. And Jack got up there just in time to, you know, solve the whole problem, because that 3rd girl, the prettiest of all, she threw her arms around Jack and she said, my man. She gave him a big sloppy kiss, and Will and Tom went, you can have her. And so Will married the oldest, and Tom married the middle girl, and Jack married the youngest girl. And they moved apart at that point because there were some family issues that never were quite resolved. And so they built pole cabins in separate corners of that mountain, and they started raising pigs and chickens and cows and young'uns everywhere. And next thing you knew, there were cabins all over that mountain. And that's how it all got started, you know. That's how those settlements really got going, between Jack and his brothers and the old fire dragon man. And that's about the end of that.
Oh, fantastic.
Oh, brilliant. I was so concentrating on the story, I forgot to unmute us all. Mike, you're still, you need to unmute yourself as well. Let's unmute. There we go. Oh, fantastic story. And that is sort of a pretty Boston sort of typical, in some ways, Jack story. Kind of that proper kind of all the threes, and Jack the hero and the pretty girl and all the defeating the giant or the monster. It's just just a version that I've never heard, and I love it. And I could hear little snippets of Ray coming through it as well.
Oh yeah.
Just...
And there's oftentimes that girl is the guy, you know. And I think of this in terms of the Jungian anima, you know. She's the soul, the figure that leads the man out into the world. And that's not just the man, you know, that's the active part of the human condition. That, you know, wherever we go out in the world, that represents that's Jack in us. And, you know, my friend Kathleen, the storyteller from Southern California, who I brought up to meet Ray, she said, you know, Ray started his story by saying, every man can be Jack. And, you know, Kathleen, being from California, she interrupted and she said, you mean every person? And Ray just fell right in. He said, yeah, every person can be Jack if he's got a mind and a heart to help people. Mm-hmm. And he just went on with a story like that.
Fantastic. And I think there are often a strong woman who's going to help him. There's the mother at the beginning, but there's an awful lot of old women, you know, helpers who kind of test him, going, you know, if you'll help me, there'll be a little bit of magical help for you later on. Right. Or the young girl who just watches him shine and shine and shine.
Or the daughter of the master of the mountain. Yeah, that's very, very much a characteristic figure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to know more about those girls, though, and all of those magical things. I just kind of want to know more what's behind the door and what the treasures that he didn't look for in his depression must have been there. Well, we've been to America, where obviously there's all the stories kind of gathered from lots of places all over the world. But kind of go back to my home turf, really. And obviously although I love Scottish Traveller stories, and I've really become sort of got to know loads of those through Duncan. I am English, and that's where I come from. And Mike is not very far from where I live, in kind of the heart of England in Shropshire. And I'd love to hear a little bit about English Jack.
Well, English Jack. Well, when I got started, and we're going back into the 70s, really, Amy. And there was when I wanted to check out and what people go back to the sources is what they say sometimes. There was a couple of farmers around Worcestershire. One was Wedgbury and the other was Malcolm Meikle. And they were rich men. Joseph, the fellows that you talk about up at the Appalachians, it doesn't sound that if there's a wealth behind them. It is Middle England, and they've been farming 200 acres or so for the last 500 years, right? And this is some of the best agricultural land that you'll ever come across. You don't harvest the corn. The day before, you can walk across it and back again, right? You're getting 4 ton an acre off all sorts of things, and they make a fortune out of lavender seeds nowadays down there. But in the summer times, the traveling peoples would be welcome because they did all the work. And so they'd come to and they'd do all the picking, and they would be on their way down to the Vale of Evesham, which is called the breadbasket of England sometimes. And these were the guys that do all the harvesting. And they weren't needed in the winter, but they were desperately needed in the summer. And I worked alongside some of these. I worked for Malcolm Meikle for a long, not for a long time, for about a year. And Wedgbury was a very close friend of ours. And so if I came across any of the stories, now the tradition would be Fred Archer and John Moore. Now, John Moore, he wrote a whole load of books, but he's the guy who started off the Cheltenham Literature Festival, and his family still run an estate agent down through Cheltenham and Tewkesbury and round through there. And these guys, there is a wealth behind these families. But so if I came across a story that I wanted to check out, that would be where I went. Now, the one I'm just about to tell, I'm pretty certain I got it off Pat Ryan, but I'm not quite certain originally. But Pat is a great friend of mine, but when he told you a story, he'd put a curved ball in there from time to time, and you needed to check it out. So I went back to those guys and said, have you heard of this? And they had. They'd heard it in a different way, but they'd heard the story before. And Jack does turn up in those stories down through there. He turns up in all sorts of different ways and styles. And what they used to do was at the end of the season, when the traveling people were about to leave, they'd have a party, and the farmer would pay for it. They'd have a big barrel of cider, and they'd sit there, and it would go way into the evenings. And that's when they sometimes swapped stories and didn't swap stories. And then those guys would move off and they'd come back. And they come in their benders and things like that. So those were the guys I go back to and check it out. So the Jack story I was going to tell tonight, because Amy's been asking for a while, she wanted some of the stories to have a strong female lead in them. And this is the one that I can think of that has that. For once there was a king, and the silly bugger woke up dead one morning. So he was completely dead. So they said, God save the king, here comes the king. And the king's son became king. Well, he was a bit before his time, and he was a good lad, but he was clever enough to know that he knew he wasn't that clever. And that was fine. And he recognized that if he was going to survive in this world and being king of the kingdom, and his dad would be a very good king, he was going to need a good wife. And he'd need a clever wife. So he decided that he would stand in the square of the town, because he couldn't afford to fall in love. He would just needed a good wife to help him through. He would stand there and he'd get all the wise men together, and they would ask 3 questions. And then any woman who could answer the 3 questions, who wasn't particularly well old, she had to be about the same age as he was, he'd marry her and they could rule the kingdom together. With a bit of luck, he'd have a companion that would help him rule. Now, round the corner, down the side, through the alley, just down by the docks, a fellow called Jack lived. Now, Jack, his wife had died at childbirth, and he lived with his daughter, Mary. Now, Mary, in this time, she was about 20, 21, about that age. But Jack himself, because it happened later on in his life, he was well old. He was up sort of 70, 75 or so, about by then. And they lived in a little cottage together. And she basically said, right, well, you looked after me when I was a nipper and nobody else was going to do that. It's part of the roles in my life is going to be looking after you. And they lived in harmony together. But Jack, on his way back from the pub, he'd heard the thing the king was going to do. See, he thought, well, my Mary could be queen. That's the best pension plan I can think of. Well, that would be really, really good. So he went back and he pitched the idea. He said to Mary, why don't you go and listen to the 3 questions the king's going to ask? And if you can answer them, because I'm sure we'll think up the answers between us. We've done this loads of times. Not a problem at all. You can be queen and I can come and live in the palace, and I can go to the pub every night and have 4 pints of beer. Brilliant. Mary, she looked completely disdainful. That's the last thing I want to be, is the queen. You know, you're going to have to talk to all those stuffy ambassadors and And do you know how big that castle is? Someone's going to have to clean it, and it's going to end up being me. And I'm not interested in being queen. No, we're not going to do that. And that's the end of it. Well, it came to Saturday lunchtime. And Saturday lunchtime, midday, was when the king was going to ask the questions. And she sorted the cows out. She'd done the pigs. She'd sorted all the housing out. She put the tea in for later. And she had to deliver some eggs. And she was just walking through the town square when the king walked forward, and there was great big trumpets and everything else. And he asked the first question. And the first question was this: how deep is the deepest part of the sea? And everybody went quiet. And Mary just looked around and said, what kind of question's that? That's easy. The deepest part of the sea is a stone's throw. You chuck it in the top and it always goes down to the bottom. It's a stone's throw. Can't you think of anything cleverer than that? And off she went. Well, the king looked at the wise men, and the wise men looked at the king, and they all went back into the castle, and they all sort of walked around thinking about it, because they had to think of another question for the next day. Anyway, pretty much the same thing happened again. Mary, she did all her work and everything else. Jack was pushing her out the door. She had some eggs to deliver. It was a Sunday lunchtime, and he was off to the pub for his Sunday lunch. And Mary, she happened to be walking through the square, and out came all the trumpets again, and out came the king. And the king said, right, he said, I want to know how many stars there are in the sky. Well, Mary said, well, that's easy. And everybody stopped at her. Now, all the wise men went, but there was a couple of young girls round there, and they were looking at Mary, and they hated her, and the claws were all coming out, and they turned round and they looked at her and said, go on then, if you can answer the question straight away, why don't you answer the question? And Mary just shook her hands and she said, I haven't got time for all this. How many stars are there in the sky? It's the same number of grains of sand there are on the beach down by the shore there. If you don't believe me, go and count them both. Well, there was complete silence again. And off she went, and she went round and she started playing. Jack came home and said, how'd you get on? She said, well, I've answered the 2 and I don't want to be queen. But you know something? I've had a look at him and he is a bit cute. Ah, said Jack, that's brilliant. What the third question's going to be? Well, I haven't got time for this. Anyway, so, but Mary started thinking about it and everything else. And she was there that day on purpose again. And the trumpets came out and the king came out and he said, this is what's going to have to happen. He said, you've answered 2 questions. Nobody else has answered anymore. So this question is specifically for you, Mary. I found out who you are and where you lived and all that. We all know about you. Don't you know about it? If you can do this, within a week, I'll marry you. Oh, go on then, said Mary. He said, you've got to stand in front of me dressed and undressed. You've got to be riding and not riding, and it's got to be not day and not night. Got it? Mary went, yes. And off she went. And everybody looked at her, but she didn't look back. She just went off, did what she had to do, went back to the cottage and started talking to her father, Jack. Well, the next morning, at exactly dawn, she was outside the castle and she was banging on the door big time. And they opened the castle doors up and there was, she said, I want to see the king and I want to see him at exactly dawn, which is now. And the king was there and he was in his dressing gown. And he looked at her and she said, it is exactly dawn. So it's not day and it's not night. I am sat on a little pony here. So I'm sat there, but my feet are on the ground. So I'm not riding and I'm not sitting, but I'm riding and sitting at the same time. And as you can see, I am dressed in a fisherman's net. So I'm dressed and undressed at exactly the same time. And he got down on one knee, put his hand out, someone put a ring in his finger, and he said the immortal words that every woman wants to hear. Would you do me the honour of being my wife? Well, within a week, they were married. But when they sat down afterwards and had a bit of a pause just before the wedding, the king turned round to Mary and said, listen, he said, there is one thing you have to do. I get that you're cleverer than me. I don't mind that at all. We can make that work, but you mustn't show me up in public. You mustn't turn round so all the people in the kingdom laugh at me, because I'm the king and that can't happen. And so she agreed and they shook hands on it. Well, it was a lovely wedding. She had a lovely gown and Jack was in his element. He thought this was absolutely brilliant. You know, not only was his daughter now going to be the queen, he happened to own a whole sling of pubs. And one of them was under the castle walls down by the docks. And then the king turned round to the father and said, well, you can have 4 pints for free every night down there. Don't bother us too much. And he thought that was the best son-in-law he could ever find. Well, everything was going wrong. Now, the way the kingdom worked was on a Tuesday and a Thursday, the king would have to sit on his throne and the people from the town would come up and he'd have to sort of solve arguments or come across disputes, and he'd have to work out who was going to do that. In a bit like a combination between a councillor and a judge nowadays, and Google or something along those. But he was just sat there by himself, and he did his best. But on the whole, he didn't particularly like doing it, and he wasn't particularly good at it. But he, like he said, he did his best. You see? So he sat there the first time, and Mary, it was a Tuesday morning, Mary came down and sat just a little bit behind him on a chair. You see, and this farmer came in and they were having disputes about fishing rights and everything else. And what he hated doing was saying, well, I'll have to go and think about it, come back on Thursday. He always liked to come up with an answer. And he was thinking about it. He said he wasn't quite sure what the answer was. And there was a bit of a knock on his knee. And he looked round and there was a piece of paper under the desk. And he opened up the desk and underneath, and there was the answer. And he looked at Mary and she went, and he picked up the piece of paper and said, I think we ought to do that. As he said it, he heard everybody go, well, that's a good solution. And suddenly he liked it. And he looked round and she poked him and said, don't look at me, look forward. And he went, oh, so anyway, so that's how it used to be. He used to be there. She'd sit just behind him. And if there was a problem, she'd just write a piece of paper and he'd give it to her. And invariably, she was right. Sometimes she was wrong, but most of the time she was right. But it was certainly a valuable asset. And he began to rely on her. And that was great. And everything was going fine. And I'd missed one thing out. She was a bit of a randy git. Was married because a baby turned up. So she went into her confinement and she wasn't there for a couple of weeks before she had the baby. And then she had the baby to look after. So for about a month, she wasn't there, but he coped and that was fine. Then the second time it happened about a year later, same thing happened, but she was gone for about a month, but he coped and that was fine. Now, about 4 years later, from the beginning, she got pregnant again for the third time, but this time it was a little girl. It turned out to be a little girl anyway, but and she was unwell, and you know, pregnancies go well and they don't go bad well, and she was been sick in the mornings, and she was saying this is the last time, we're not going to have any more children, and that was fine with him and everything else, but she had to take to her bed. So she wasn't there for about 6 weeks, but he was coping all right, he was getting there and everything else. And then two farmers came in, and what had happened was this: there was a boundary between the two farmers, and in one field there was a black stallion, and in the other field, there was a brown cow, and the brown cow had had a calf, and the calf had wandered through the fence and gone and stood by the black stallion. And the guy who owned the black stallion said, that calf is mine, it's worth a lot of money. And the guy who owned the brown cow was saying, no, black stallions can't have brown calves. It's obviously mine and it's gone through the fence. And there was an argument, they couldn't agree and they weren't agreeing. And so they came to the king. They said, what do you do? Well, the king, he thought, this is easy. This is no problem at all. I've read my Bible This is in the old book, Solomon's Wisdom. It is right. So you put the black stallion one end of the room, you put the brown cow the other end of the room, and you put the calf in the middle, and the calf will go to its mother. That's easy, and that's exactly what they did. Apart from one thing, the brown cow went and stood by the black stallion, and he looked at this, and he went, "Well, I suppose the black stallions had the brown car. It'd better go with that farmer." And as he was saying it, it didn't seem right. And everybody started looking at him. And he said, "We'll call it for a day." And he went out and he sat down there and he had a cup of tea and he was scratching his head. And he said, "I'm sure that's what they have to do in the Bible." But anyway, no one said anything to him. He hadn't got anything particularly wrong for a long time, but they could all see there was no logic about this at all. But he decided he'd call it all off. So he called it all off. And he went down to the great big pond down there with all his pals, and he started fishing every day instead. Well, Mary, she had a little daughter. She sorted it all out. And a couple of days later, she was walking past with her ladies, and she had the two boys, and and the king was there fishing. And she walked over and said, "Do you mind if I have a go?" And he said, No, if you're feeling well enough, come and go." And she picked up the fishing rod, and she turned around and she cast it straight into the middle of the hayfield behind her. And the king went, "What are you doing?" And everybody started laughing. And she looked around, she goes, "Why are you all laughing at me?" And the king went, "Well, you're not going to catch a fish in the middle of a hayfield." And she said, "I've got as much chance of catching a fish in the middle of a hayfield as a black stallion has of having a brown calf." And there was a complete silence. And the king looked at her and he went, "I told you 4 years ago, before we got married, you were never to show me up and never make me the laughing stock. And that's what you've done this day. So what you have to do now is to take the three things you love the most out of the castle and go back to Jack's house. You're sacked. The paperwork will follow. It's called a divorce. Leave now." And she turned round, and with her best Methuselah-eyed look, she looked at him, she looked at her children, she bundled them all up, and she went back into the castle. And just as he got to the castle gate, she goes, "You've got 1 hour, and I'm counting 59 minutes. Well, he went up there. Now, one of the other things she did do was keep an eye on his drinking. Now, he used to like a beer or so, but sometimes he drank too much. But he always admitted it, and he always apologised in the morning, and he wasn't particularly old himself, and going on a jolly with his mates, well, that was okay. But in the castle, she did keep a bit of he wouldn't allow to start early, and he had to finish a bit early and stuff like that. Anyway, that day, as he walked in, on the table where he sat for his tea was a great big bottle of beer that someone had left there for him. And he went, "Right, well, there's no one around to stop me having that tonight." So he started it, and he opened up it, and he started drinking it, and he called for another one. Then his tea came, and he called for another one, and he called for another one, and he drank. Then he started on the cider. Then someone had a grand idea, get the bottle of whiskey out, and that disappeared. Then someone else got another bottle of whiskey out. And about 12 o'clock that night, he hadn't even eaten his pudding. He picked up the whiskey, but instead of putting it down his throat, he just fell forward, smack on the table, with his face in the pudding. Now, the next morning he woke up and he looked round and he knew something was wrong, but he was in his own bed. So there's always a good thing when you absolutely get, you've had a few many to drink, you get a bit tiddly, whatever they say in Appalachians or up in Scotland, you've had a few drinks and that. If you wake up in your own bed, it's a good sign. But he looked round, but his bed wasn't where it should be. But he did recognise it because his bed was in her old room in Jack's cottage. And at the end of the bed was his three children, the two boys and the little babby and Mary. And he sat up and said, "I've sacked you." And she said, "You listen to me, pal. You said I had to leave the castle with the three things I love the most in my life. Well, the marriage bed that was ours, where we created three children, that came first. The three children we created, that came second. And you silly old bugger, you were the third one. So I brought you as well. And we're all staying here for a week in Jack's house." And the king looked at him and he looked round and he saw the things he loved the most in his life. And he heard Jack knocking around the kitchen, making him the biggest breakfast that you could, because a good breakfast is a good time if you've had too much to drink. And he started laughing. And he went, "How many times do you know a black stallion can have a brown calf?" And everybody started laughing. And everybody in the country started laughing, but he didn't mind. And he stayed there for a week. And he took the whole lot back to the castle and he stayed there. But they didn't have any more children. And every time he had to do his counselling, he made sure that she was there, because she was the staff of his life and the person he relied upon of all. The one thing that Jack did get out of all this, because he was living in the little cottage now by himself, but every evening, 7 o'clock in the evening, on the dot, he'd walk from his cottage, he'd buy a newspaper, and he'd walk round to the pub, and there he could have 4 pints of beer. And he did that, and for years and years and years, until the little boys in the story got to be about 16 and 17 and 18. And everybody knew in the whole town that he did that. But one day they walked round and there was nobody in the pub. Jack wasn't there. And they sent a message up to Mary, and Mary went into the cottage, and there was Jack. And he was sat in a chair, and he was by the fire, and he looked asleep. But she knew he wasn't asleep. So she did all the things that need to be done. And they buried Jack. And on his gravestone it says, "Here lies Jack." And that's all it says. And that was the last time anybody told a Jack story about the old fella, Jack.
Oh, what a great story. Well told, Mike. And
so I went back to, sorry, Amy, I went back to Reg and Malcolm and Fred Archer and John Moore. And they finished off the story for me. So I got some of it from one place and some of it from another in that particular lane. Okay. But that's where I go to check out if there's Jack stories. And I will happily steal the ones you told me, Heather and Joseph, and go back there. Malcolm himself now is 92 and is still going. He still lives on the same farm that his grandfather farmed. Reg Berry we lost in the last century. Yeah. He's buried in the same graveyard as my father. But there's other people I know there. Fred Archer's first wife and one or two others. But because of all this COVID-19, I haven't been able to go and check for more stories, Amy, which I will do when things are happening. Okay.
Well, you can get more stories, but I think you've got enough to be going on with, to be fair.
I
want
to be fair to
Wales. Too many is the answer, probably. Yeah.
To be fair to Wales, there is a Jack Tale tradition here that was collected by John Sampson and Dora Yates in the teens, and Daniel Morden's been doing a lot of work with that. So, you know, the Jack does get around. He's certainly in all the kingdoms of the British Isles. Anyway.
Yes, that was a bit dismissive of me. I didn't mean to be like that. Jack is definitely Wales. I think Jack gets most places, but I suppose when you look at the English tradition, Jack is one of the things that you think of first, and with Scotland. And my personal sort of connection with Wales, when I look at Welsh stories, I think Mabinogion, I think fairies, I think the Tylwyth Teg, and Jack's there, but he's like, you know, down the list.
Yeah, he's in.
Well, the thing about the Welsh, the thing about the Welsh stories is their heart is made of poetry and storytelling, and there's an awful lot of stuff. John Davis and people like David Davis and all those kinds of things, and I love going there. So they don't. He is there, but he's not very prominent. I would say that. Well, it hasn't been for me personally. Then put it that way. Okay. Yeah. I live on the Welsh border. So.
Well. There's lots of great comments on the chat, which I will be sharing with everybody. And Chloe says, my daughter says, thank you very much, and she's going to bed. I think she's gone to the Cinderella version of the story rather than Jack. And it is sort of getting to that time for all of us. So it is now past 10, and there has been a lot of talk about Jack-o'-lantern on the chat. So I'm going to just refer to that a little bit. Jack-o'-lantern, Yeah, I would say it is a Jack story, but there's lots of versions of Jack-o'-lantern, and I don't know which ones you know. But that story that it's the same one that Joseph was referring to of Jack who, and it does sum up a lot of Jack actually. He's not good enough to go to heaven. He's not bad enough to go to hell.
Right.
He walks that middle road because he's a rogue, he's a trickster, and he, you know, that there's a lot of grey areas about Jack. So he always has that good heart. But yes, the first line did include bugger, and that's a very Jack thing to say. He certainly, you know.
Sorry.
No. They were talking about the best first line of your story, and Claire's going, "Oh no, I forgot the first line, but I think it included the word bugger." And I think it was, the king was dead, silly old bugger, I think was the first line.
Wow.
Yeah, he woke up dead, the silly bugger. They've just been talking about, you know, Claire saying the best first line of a story. And that's the thing about, so Jack-o'-lantern, Jack ends up with a coal from hell that he's given to walk in this world because he is of this world. Right. He doesn't get to go to heaven, he doesn't get to go to hell, but he has this coal to walk, and that's becomes a Jack-o'-lantern, or the will-o'-the-wisp, that can sometimes lead people astray, sometimes shows them the way to go. And so Jack may be dead at the end of this evening, but he's still there, he's still walking. There is that light in the darkness, that little trickster and that flicker, and I don't think Jack is going anywhere.
Well, someone did say to me once, after I told that story, that the second of the two boys was called Jack, because they named it his grandfather, and that just restarts it all off again. But it was not something I'd heard of until someone came to me in a pub after and said, "Why don't you do that?" So
I assumed that the two boys, it would be going on, and there's so many more things that we could talk about with Jack, and there's questions that we thought we might be answering and talking about tonight when we were thinking about what we might do tonight, and we knew it was going to be tricky to squeeze Jack into an evening, even though we've done it as 2 hours instead of 1 hour. So I just want to thank everybody for coming and for joining us tonight and to celebrate Jack. And absolutely, there's not enough time, but this is sort of a lifetime's work, and everybody here is doing other things connected with Jack, so you can catch up with all of us. So Mike is running Getawords at Edgeways. I'm sure that Jack will be
we run a Jack session,
little bit of a corner there. Yeah, absolutely. And also on story rounds and things, you can, you know, become friends with Mike Westlands at the festival. You find out more Jack there. Joseph has a new book coming out really soon, 1st of August. Tell us very quickly a little bit about your book, Joseph.
Okay, well, it's called Liars, Damn Liars, and Storytellers.
Yeah.
And it's a book of essays about traditional and contemporary storytelling. And it kind of traces the line between tradition and the revival and the contemporary storytelling scene, which is so diverse. But the first section of the book is all about Jack tales.
I'm really looking forward to it coming out. But we can't get it from you, can we? Is it published in the States?
It's published by the University of Tennessee Press, but it will be available on Amazon and everything else. So yeah,
that's the place for us to look for it, really.
I want a signed copy.
Yeah, we all want a signed copy.
We all want a signed copy. Yeah.
Well, bring me your copies, and I'll as soon as we got a vaccine for COVID,
when we meet in person, we can do it. Peter's going, "Oh, my dad was a Jack and he changed tonight. I'll have to hear more Jack stories." I think that's why I got interested in Jack, because both my grandfathers were called Jack. My mother is Jacqueline, and it's Jack has just always been in my family. It's just like, how can I not tell Jack stories? But Heather's working on a fantastic project with the Elphinstone Institute about Stanley's material, aren't you? And you're working on 2 companion books that are going to be coming out.
Well, my mother is. My mum's putting that together, and it's kind of loosely based on her PhD, but it's mainly the archive itself, and just trying to, and I think probably one of the books, because Jack Tales did sort of become the focus of, it was a comparative study of Jack Tales from Ray Hicks and Stanley Robertson. Right. And so Jack Tales, there's so many Jack Tales. So I think one of the books will be some of the stories as a collection. But the idea is, hopefully with Elphinstone, is to create a website where people can, about Stanley. And there'll be, because I think our vision is that we want people, not only you can hear a lot of stuff on Kister Riches, as you've already mentioned, Amy. But we want them to be able to access that material from Elphinstone and from the School of Scottish Studies, and also video material, because being able to hear and see Stanley, and same with all these other storytellers. I mean, the people, us four here, we have been so fortunate. We have been so lucky to have actually known some of these amazing characters and spent time in their company. And I think that's the idea of trying to pass that on so that people get a sense of this legacy that we're all
Exactly.
kind of nurturing and hopefully passing on.
Here, absolutely.
It is stronger than I found it when in the 70s, in the 80s. It's a lot stronger than it was when I first started. It's a lot bigger, and it's a lot broader. It's a lot deeper, a lot better.
A lot of that is thanks to Duncan and Stanley and people like that.
Yeah, you opened up and shared it all.
Yeah,
absolutely. So watch out for all those amazing things coming, and I've got a little plug for myself as well, because I am going to be doing Strange Times Online Storytelling Club on Friday. So if you're on Facebook, I think you can only really access it through Facebook. Join the Strange Times Online Storytelling Club, and the link will be posted on there. And on Friday night, I'm going to be doing Travelling Together, which is my story of meeting Duncan and my first week with him, but it's interwoven with Jack and Beggar's Island, which is one of Duncan's Jack stories, and one that, you know, it's one of those meteor long ones that I was saying I might not have time for tonight, but so get to have a good meaty Duncan Jack tale. So if you fancy coming to that, it'd be great to have your company. But it's just been a fantastic night. Thank you so much, Joseph Sobol, Heather Yule, Mike Rust, to everybody who has come and listened, and to all the great comments and questions that you've been putting up on the chat. We just have one more taking the tradition on. So next week is going to be the last one in this series, and it's going to be a very different evening. So instead of a webinar, it is going to be a meeting. So you might have to put some clothes on next week. So you don't have to be posh, but respectable would be good. And because I want you, there's been a lot of people who've been coming to a lot of these sessions, and I see people's names on there who I know are just really erudite and like have a lot to say. So I just got some questions about the tradition to finish off, and to ask everybody else, everybody's opinion about taking the tradition on and where we should go. So that will be next week, and look at my site, my Facebook site, my website to, if you want to come and join me for that. But for now, thank you and good night.
Thanks, everybody. Great to see you.
thank you for being here. Yeah.
Thank you.